All right, last video for our Unit 4 review. So in this video, we're going to talk about reasonable domain and range in terms of real-world situations, how you can tell what is a reasonable domain and range. So best advice is for you to understand reasonable just means you need to find the limitations. Infinity might not be answers in this case. Usually that happens in real-world situations. So here I have a scenario of a diver standing on a diving board 25 feet above the water. The graph below shows the path of the diver as he's jumping off the diving board and into the water. And this parabola does keep going. If you were to graph in your calculator, it does keep going. But realistically speaking, in the real world scenario, we do not have, in terms of time, we don't have negative amounts. And in terms of height, we also don't have negative amounts. So it only makes sense to say that we got to focus on the quadrant 1 of the coordinate grid, coordinate plane, and just give those limitations of what's the minimum and what's the maximum, what's the minimum and what's the maximum. So that's what reasonable domain and range mean. So you're going to write it down in the order of minimum comma maximum. That's the interval notation. You have to decide whether to put parentheses or braces or brackets. I still get confused with those. My apologies. One of those, brackets or braces. So minimum meaning what's the furthest left for domain, what's the furthest right for domain. That will be your maximum. When it comes to range, minimum and maximum, you have to ask yourself what's the lowest y value and what's the highest y value. And again, we are using values, so you have to use those brackets or braces. So for minimum on domain, we're looking at the diver being on the jumping board, and that's at 0 seconds minimum. Then he jumps and lands in the water eventually. So what was the maximum amount of seconds that took? So that's where you look at your x-intercept. It looks like it's 3.5. So we're going to write that down. And then you put those brackets around and that will be your domain. This is the interval notation. So you also got to know the inequality notation. So you're just going to say that is from 0 all the way to 3.5. And you're just going to say x values that are less than or equal to 3.5, but they're also greater than or equal to 0. And I know it sounds opposite of what I'm writing, but when you have x is greater than or equal to 0 and then you flip it, the 0 goes there. Notice that the inequality is pointing to it, so it ends up pointing to it again, and then the x goes there. So this is the inequality notation for that domain. For range, we're going to have a minimum. What's the lowest amount of height that the diver has up above the water? So definitely the minimum will be 0 when it's landing on the water. And then the maximum would be what's the highest that it was off the water. So that's where you kind of analyze the graph, and it looks like it's right here at 30. And we're going to say 30. And this is the range, the reasonable range. For the inequality notation, it's going to be same thing, 0 as your minimum, 30 as your maximum, y in the middle. Y has to be less than or equal to 30, and y has to be greater than or equal to 0. And again, when you write the y is greater than or equal to 0, and then you switch it up, this also switches the sign like that. So then you just end up looking like this. Okay, I hope that wasn't too confusing. Let's try it again. So pause the video and try this example on your own, and then you can verify if you got it. All right, so a bottle rocket is launched off of an 80-meter high cliff, so it starts at 80 and lands in the valley below. The graph below shows the height of the rocket, and then it lands below. Right here in tiny numbers, it says 144 meters. I'm assuming it's pointing to that maximum value. And then it's definitely landing at 5. What is a reasonable domain and why? So domain, again, is x and y. I'm sorry, x, left and right. And we need to write it in minimum, comma, maximum order. So the minimum will be your furthest left, which is right here, so 0. Furthest right, which is 5. Put those inequalities, and that's your domain. I'm sorry, your brackets. And then if we write in inequality, it will have 0 less than or equal to x less than or equal to 5. Now it says y. Well, it's because it starts at 0 and lands on the ground 5, probably seconds. It says t equals seconds. So lands on the ground 5 seconds later. Okay, so that's y. Let's try the range. Range is up and down. And following the template of minimum and maximum, we're going to have the lowest value. The lowest value that it can go is the ground, so it's 0. And then the highest, it was 144. So we're going to say 0, 144 with the bracket. Inequality notation will be this 0 less than y less than 144. And then as far as y, well, again, it starts at 80. However, the highest it goes is 144. $144 meters off the ground and lands on the ground, which will be that 0 right there. All right, so I hope this video helps you understand a little bit on reasonable domain and range. Good luck on the test.